There's always a strong temptation to think of the brain or to call the brain a machine or talk about it as a computer.
When I was in medical school, we were taught that the brain is what it is and nothing really can change it.
I learned that the brain was pretty much hardwired and that what you've got by the age of 18, you're left with.
All of this work suggests that we need to radically change this old view of the brain.
I think we're now learning that in fact, the brain is changing all the time, that the brain is changing with everything we think, with everything we experience.
My name is Dr. Norman Doidge. I wrote a book called The Brain That Changes Itself.
I'm here today to describe what I've come to believe is the most important change in our understanding of the human brain in 400 years. This idea is revolutionary because for 4 centuries, mainstream medicine and science have seen the brain as fixed and described it as though it were a complex machine with parts, each of which perform one mental function in a single location in the brain. This machine metaphor gave rise to what I've called the doctrine of the unchanging brain, a sense that treatment for many brain conditions was impossible or unwarranted took hold, and it spread through the culture, even stunting our overall view of human nature. But what if the idea of the brain as machine or mechanism is not only wrong, but spectacularly wrong? When I first heard reports that the human brain might not be hardwired, I had to investigate and began a series of travels, and in the process met a band of brilliant scientists at the frontiers of brain science who'd made a series of unexpected discoveries. These scientific heretics began to call this new brain property neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity changes everything. The brain is not a machine. It has to be understood on its own terms. And this is the remarkable story of the brain that changes itself.
I went to Madison, Wisconsin to meet with Mitch Tyler and Yuri Danilov, 2 people who had worked with Paul Bach-y-Rita, perhaps the most important pioneer of his generation, the great visionary of neuroplasticity, who, after some very personal experiences with the death of his father, figured out that the human brain is plastic, and then began to invent all these extraordinarily ingenious devices to help people rewire their brains.
Given that Paul was a visual neuroscientist, and that's where his training was, he was looking for a way to demonstrate this idea of this neuroplasticity, or the brain's ability to rehabilitate itself. And the logical extension of that would have been in the blind population developing a blind prosthesis, if you will, or a sensory substitution device.
Okay, Bill, let's try something a little different now.
Okay, it's a telephone, and the receiver is to the right.
In sensory substitution, he claimed that brain is flexible, plastic, and smart enough to analyze any information that you can deliver accurately to the brain.
Where you could actually take signals from a video camera and presenting this stimulus on the back of a patient who was blind, and have them be able to pick up that information as though it was coming from their retina and treat that information the same way. It's vision. It doesn't matter where the signal is coming from.
How a sensation entered the brain was not important to Bach-y-Rita. What was important was what the brain did with that sensation.
The source of the signal is really almost immaterial. As long as you provide that signal to the brain and give it a context that it's being used in, the brain will figure out how to use it and use it to its own ends, to both rehabilitate and also to perform the task that it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I'm 54, and I've been blind for 38 years, totally blind.
Let's stay inside the lines, Roger.
I see black, but I have no eyes whatsoever.
Over the years, that big dentist chair and massive computer behind it have all shrunk down so that it pretty well fits into a pair of glasses with a mini camera in it.
The simplest way I've described it is when you're kids and you're laying in bed and one of your brothers, sisters are drawing on your back with your finger and you're trying to guess what it is. It's kind of the same principle in the sense this device is drawing it on your tongue in vibrations.
Roger, that turn was incredible.
Yeah, it was a sharp one. Wait a minute. So
You
it's
didn't cut it at all.
It's drawing images onto your tongue, and I try to get the whole image as much as I can on this little 1" by 1" sensor. It's tracing it like you do on your back when you're kids, but it's now tracing it on your tongue electronically.
And see if you can try and put your hand on the top of the arrow. A little higher.
I mean, definitely people think, well, it's touch. Well, not for me. I mean, as soon as I put that on, within a matter of seconds, I am seeing it. I mean, I talk about seeing because I am. It's drawing pictures in my head.
Perfect.
I mean, this was very emotional for me, and I told my wife the same thing. I said, maybe someday I'll be able to see your face for the first time ever in my life.
We have senses that we don't know we have until we lose them, and balance is one of them.
In this helmet, we have a little 2-axis accelerometer, and what it does is converts your head position information into a little signal that's presented on the tongue display here. You can also
Once Bach-y-Rita realized that you could get sensory modules that seemed to process one sensation to process another, he turned to a very important problem, the problem of balance.
And what I'm going to have you do is go ahead and just put it in, and your job is to actually keep that little red square in the middle of the box. So it actually moves in response to the position of the helmet.
Today you can see Cheryl Schultz riding a bike, which seems like a very ordinary event, but actually it's most extraordinary because Cheryl Schultz is a woman who had her balance apparatus almost completely obliterated as a side effect from a medication she received.
One morning when I tried to get out of bed, I literally fell to the floor. I tried to get up, tried to get on my hands and knees, and I was just wobbling around, and I just would fall again, and I'd fall again, and I remember looking, and it was more of like a never-ending sense of tumbling. And the doctor told me that it is a permanent condition, but you learn to get used to it. And actually, the worst word of it all was permanent. Permanent made things stop. It made it stop that this is just the only way it will ever be.
So how is Cheryl able to ride a bike?
When we first met Cheryl, she was a wobbler, a self-described person with a balance problem and on disability. But she was wobbling profoundly. What I also realized is that this is her world. This is something that she lives with every day.
I always had this constant noise in my head, and not a noise that, like, you hear a noise, but this feeling of noise. If you could hear confusion, that's what it sounds like. And my brain was really, really confused because it didn't know what to do. It was so consumed with just trying to stand up and stay straight. When I put that device in, it was just like, oh, it's like I stepped out of that room and I'm standing on the side of the ocean or something. It was just like, oh my gosh, it's quiet, it's still, and it feels so good. It's like I came back.
Bach-y-Rita thought that the brain could rewire itself by unmasking alternate pathways or sprouting new ones. What Cheryl's brain is doing is receiving the signals from her tongue and sending them to the part of her brainstem that normally processes touch. It's then that her brain redirects this information to the area that deals with balance by unmasking dormant pathways.
Well, the analogy that I think I inherited from Paul is that if you're the normal nervous system, you have your major pathways. They're sort of like the freeways in your brain that handle large volumes of information and do it very efficiently. But if there's an accident on the highway, you can either sit in traffic and not do anything, or you can get off on the secondary road. Over time, what the brain does is it takes those back roads and turns them into the superhighways and reroutes the information. So we're taking the existing pathways and making them more efficient.
By having that sensation on my tongue, I had to reroute my patterns and my thoughts and how my brain was functioning to focus on that input, if you will.
Cheryl was able to pick up that signal within a couple of minutes and learn how to move head left, right, front, back, and pick up the signal and maintain upright posture, perfect posture. She stood with military precision almost, and we were amazed by that.
And when we realized that she's stabilizing her body, we decided to remove the device from the mouse and see how long she can stay and keep the balance afterwards.
And what we found was, when we took the strip from my mouth, that there was a residual. It would follow a little bit. You know, the longer we did it, the longer the residual.
So then when we just continue exploration of this residual effect, we figure out that the effect have ability to accumulate. With each training session, it's getting longer.
Suddenly, there was a profound realization that these people don't have to use this device all the time. That there's something more than just sensory substitution. It's a neurorehabilitation. The brain is learning how to change itself by use of this device. That's the big breakthrough.
The greatest thing is I'm not dependent on the device anymore. It truly, indeed, without a doubt, rewired my brain in some fashion. How, I honestly don't know, but it did.
Hey, Cheryl.
Oh, good to see you.
Good to see you. The idea that the brain could change its function, that it could morph, it could adapt to new tasks, was really radical. And it took Paul some 40 years to demonstrate that that was possible. And we're just at the front edge of finally realizing Paul's vision of being able to take this idea and run with it.
So she'll do that for a while. I think she'd like to do it as long as possible so that she gets the longer after effect.
Paul Bach-y-Rita's importance lies in being a visionary, the first of his generation, to really understand the full potential of plasticity and to begin to apply it so that it could help people, and to describe a new brain, a brain that evolves in a changing world to change itself. Sadly, Paul Bach-y-Rita is no longer with us. A couple of years ago, he developed a brain tumor and passed away.
The first thing he said when he learned, he said, "Oh, but I have to hurry. I still have many things that I want to do." He was a man with a mission, and I mean, he dedicated all his life to that.
Did he have a sense that the wave was starting to break and suddenly plasticity was just on the brink of becoming accepted for the first time?
He said, "Well, you know, I just planted some seeds, and hopefully others will continue."
So what we're realizing is we're still proving Paul right. And Paul's visionary concepts from 40 years ago are just now being realized. I think he got a glimpse of that realization, and when you see the film clip of Cheryl dancing with Paul, I think Paul finally got a glimpse of the realization, the first instance of really seeing his idea coming to fruition.
I already knew enough about the science of the brain to know that brain plasticity was possible. But then I had the extraordinary good luck to meet an amazing neuroplastician, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young,
who, as it happened, was living in our backyard, as it were, in Toronto.
What I'm doing here at Aerosmith School and in this program is actually changing cognitive capacity. The students that I work with are predominantly students with learning disabilities.
Would that be 10 minutes before, or would that be now?
We're really walking into the territory of their weaknesses. We're going in and targeting the area of difficulty. And do you know why you use the eye patch?
No.
Because this eye right here talks to this brain area over here.
Barbara Arrowsmith-Young was one of the first neuroplasticians I met. And she was a person who was born with a devastating array of learning disabilities. Many of her cognitive areas were quite retarded, in fact, in development. She had trouble speaking clearly. She didn't know where her limbs were in space. But her most devastating difficulties had to do with a difficulty in understanding how to relate symbols. This problem was so devastating for her that she really couldn't understand conversations as they were happening in real time.
Growing up, I felt very stupid. My teacher told my parents that I had a mental block and that I wouldn't learn the way other children do, and that I would have a struggle in school throughout my schooling. And being very, very literal, I actually thought that I had a wooden cube in my head that was making learning difficult. I developed all sorts of coping strategies to try to cover up. Okay, fabulous, you got it, okay.
One day, one of her very close friends and a fellow student gave her a book by Alexander Luria called A Man with a Shattered World. And it described a person who had deficits that were very much like what Barbara suffered from. It was the story of a Russian soldier who had shrapnel in his head. And he too had trouble with grammar and logic and cause and effect and couldn't read a wristwatch.
He talked about the person that couldn't tell time, couldn't understand concepts, the person that really felt that they were not able to process or understand information in real time. And it was like, it was an incredible aha moment.
That soldier's lesion was caused by the shrapnel that had been lodged in the part of the brain that integrates signals from the occipital lobe, which processes vision, the temporal lobe, which processes sound and language, and the parietal lobe, which processes touch. So now she knew the junction or area of her brain that was underperforming. The problem was, Luria was never able to provide a treatment for the poor soldier he was treating.
Then I also came across a paper by neuroscientist Mark Rosenzweig out of Berkeley, and he was looking at neuroplasticity and that the brain wasn't fixed, that the brain actually could change, that through very specific stimulation and exercise, you could change the brain at a physiological level, which then allowed effective learning to go forward. It made me realize, you know what, I don't need to be stuck with this learning disability. I don't need to live the rest of my life with it. There's a possibility here that I may actually be able to do something about it and rewire my own brain.
Because she couldn't read clocks, what she did for her first exercise was very simple and elegant.
I took a number of flashcards, I made up a number of times, and I drew the clock faces.
And then she would add a minute hand and a second hand and a hand for the week and the month and the year. And a number of weeks into it, she started to notice some extraordinary changes.
It was incredible. It was like blinders came off. And then what's your next hand? 16. Okay.
Just by these incremental exercises, she was building up new connections in those processing areas so that they could start to function eventually at an average level and then at an above average level.
What I believe this work does through specific cognitive exercises is actually stimulate the function of the underlying brain area to change it, to rewire it, to strengthen it, to improve it, and they can walk out of this program and never have to look back.
I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 2 days before my 35th birthday. Happy birthday, you have cancer. And I was told that I was going to have to do chemotherapy. I knew about the nausea, the fatigue, things like that, and I certainly got those in spades. But I also found that there's this thing called chemo brain. So chemo brain it's almost like a fog that just sort of descends on you, and it makes it really difficult to kind of process information. I would struggle for word and conversation, so I didn't have that sort of word recall that most people have. It's major memory problems that we take for granted, that we know where we put our keys. I mean, everyone's lost their keys, right? But it's a much more profound thing than that. It's this fog that descends on you, and you can't make out the details.
Well, in any case in which there's diffuse brain injury, as a consequence of something like intensive chemotherapy, basically the brain is operating with increasing noise. Basically, it's struggling to represent information in detail with high accuracy.
Mike Merzenich is the driving force behind scores of innovations of practical applications for brain plasticity. Merzenich's special ability is training people to think and perceive better by working on brain processing areas called brain maps.
Our brains represent the external world through these maps, and their borders were believed to be fixed. But Merzenich discovered that these maps can actually grow and strengthen with exercise.
Good morning. Thank you for calling Scientific Learning. How can I help you?
Well, scientific learning focuses on problems in children, and we're basically trying to improve the capacities of children through driving their brain plastically in positive or corrective directions in ways that would improve their academic performance.
One of the systems that he co-developed is called Fast Forward, and it's basically a way of treating auditory learning disabilities disguised as a computer game.
These exercises are game-like. From the kid's perspective, they're fun. But in fact, they're intensive, serious exercises, and they're actually optimized to drive the child as far as possible in a corrective or a more normal or more powerful direction as fast as possible.
One of the things that's so powerful about Fast Forward is that before the program, kids with reading difficulties have very unusual scans, very, very different from normal. But as they start to improve on the exercises, and as they start to get better at reading, Merzenich was able to show that their brain scans also normalized.
The fish are swimming.
But Merzenich's scientific work is not just for children.
Ready? So this exercise is called Bird Safari.
He has been able to prove that plasticity exists from cradle to grave. And studies show that the elderly can use his brain fitness program to sharpen their memories and function as well as they did when they were from 10 to 25 years younger.
Well, old brains slow down, and old brains, again, represent information with in lower fidelity. You can think of it as a little bit like a radio station that's no longer quite tuned to the station. Older brains forget most of what they hear. Older brains forget most of what they see. A younger brain remembers most of what it hears, remembers most of what it sees. This is machinery that also contributes greatly to controlling how we feel about life, how we operate in life, how closely we can attend to the things and enjoy the things of the world in life. And it's really important that the average older individual keep this machinery in good shape.
Click the matching arrows in order. If you hear, click the up arrow twice.
The Brain Fitness program is this great computer program. It's got several different sort of games that really press you to expand your memory.
What were the first changes you actually noticed?
I noticed my attention span lengthening. That was the first thing that I noticed. But after a couple of weeks and I started seeing changes, then I thought there really is something to this. This is really worth my time. It meant that I was going to be able to function the way I used to. It meant that I wasn't going to be limited by chemo brain.
Well, it was a typical Friday morning. I proceeded to go out to play tennis with a local pro that I've played with for about 25 years. And he says to me, "Mike, your game is not what it usually is." And I said, "My bounce is slightly off," but I continued to play.
Michael Bernstein was an eye surgeon who would work with very small instruments operating inside an eye. And he was a classically trained pianist and a tennis buff who, in the prime of life, at the age of 54, suffered an incapacitating stroke that made it impossible for him to move half of his body.
The left hand, the left arm, and left leg were paralyzed. The speech therapist and the occupational therapist said it would be very slow and not to expect too much.
Michael Bernstein was one of the first people to go to the newly opened Taub Therapy Clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, to try a new treatment called constraint-induced therapy.
Dr. Edward Taub developed the therapy for stroke victims. It can even work on people who've been paralyzed for years.
All right, go, Marlene. Go. Really let go of it.
The patient's good arm is constrained in a mitt so it can't be used, forcing their paralyzed arm to try rudimentary tasks.
Keep going.
The axiom in rehabilitation was that there was nothing you could do with these people that would make them improve, that it would enable them to use their affected extremities any better than they could.
Judy had trouble communicating. She had a very serious stroke, October 24th, surfaced.
One of the techniques that we use is called shaping. It's a kind of training technique in which you get a person to improve their motor response, their motor function in very small steps.
The essence of the cure is this incremental training. Concentrated practice helps rewire the brain by triggering plastic changes. After there has been massive brain death, new neurons are recruited to take over lost functions.
Pick that up and back up. No.
You don't try and get a person to perform a perfect movement. If they have just a rudimentary ability, you just try to get them to improve just a little bit.
Good. Good. Stretch it out. Stretch, stretch, stretch.
They're children's games to us, but to the patients, they're major life challenges.
Hello, Mr. Taylor. How are you? That's good effort. That's great. Right. Show us what's on your other hand. This one? That's the mitt.
He wears it all day here, and then when he goes home, he wears it for as many of his waking hours as he can.
So that he can't use his good hand.
Right. All right, ready, set, go. Really control it. Really control it.
People who have had stroke or traumatic brain injury frequently don't use the more affected arm, not because they can't use it. They don't use it because they've learned not to try to use it.
Nice. Take it back. Good. 3174. That's better. That's 7 seconds faster.
What we find after CI therapy is that the healthy part of the brain is recruited to produce movements of the affected arm.
Good.
And that is what we call neuroplasticity. neuroplasticity.
Taub's technique developed because he had spent years doing a form of research that involves something called deafferentation. Afferent nerves are basically like sensory nerves that feed information from the limbs to the spine. Ed Taub deafferented some monkeys so that they couldn't use their arms. Then he decided to take their deafferented arms and put them in slings.
This is a unilaterally deafferented animal. The right hand is deafferented, the right arm, and the left arm is normal.
You deafferent one limb in a monkey, and the monkey doesn't use that limb again. However, on the basis of this really rather short intervention, 1 week, placing the animal in a restraining device that prevented him from using the intact arm, he began using the deafferented arm, and then when you removed him from the restraining device, he would use the limb again for the rest of his life.
When the animal is very hungry, we can increase his motivation sufficiently to try and force him to use the deafferented limb. With adequate training, deafferented animals were capable of carrying out virtually every major category of movement.
Taub was now very excited because he wondered if this thinking could now be applied to human beings who suffered strokes.
If you could get the same result in human beings after stroke, you would then have an enormously powerful and effective way of treating stroke and traumatic brain injury and other types of damage to the central nervous system in human beings.
Keep going.
It turns out that Taub's technique is good for many conditions beyond stroke victims. He's used it with people with all kinds of brain damage, including soldiers returning from Iraq, people who have had their brains damaged by chemotherapy and radiation. It's even been used with children with cerebral palsy and proven to be effective.
Squeeze my finger and let him out. Oh, get it, get it, get it.
Good girl, we're almost done.
Sometimes the process goes slowly, and sometimes it goes remarkably rapidly. When it goes rapidly, it's almost like a miracle.
Michael Bernstein is now back at work using his hands in very fine motor activities.
I only spent 10 days of therapy with Dr. Taub, and the result was amazing. Okay, sit back. I could almost sense that each hour of doing a different task, I improved. I couldn't make that movement, or that movement, or that movement, or that. Simple movements that are required in daily life that you couldn't do because of the stroke. Okay, sit back. I hadn't touched the piano in 41 years, and I decided to get this performance together, and I sent out invitations and invited Dr. Taub and his wife.
The bottom line is that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That principle is at the heart of a revolution in rehabilitation.
One of the most important lessons I learned on this quest to understand neuroplasticity is something I call the plastic paradox. The paradox is this, that the same plasticity that allows us to change our brains and produce more flexible behaviors is also the source of many of our most rigid ones. All people start out with plastic potential. Some of us, as we grow and develop, enhance that flexibility. For others, the spontaneity, creativity, and unpredictability of childhood gives way to a routinized existence that repeats the same behavior and turns us into rigid caricatures of ourselves. Anything that involves unvaried repetition, our careers, cultural activities, skills repeated, and neuroses can lead to rigidity.
For a while, people had this notion that plasticity must be a good thing. It's a good thing that the brain can change because we can learn new things, and that's true. But if plasticity is an intrinsic property of the brain, it's neither good nor bad, it's just the way it is.
Alvaro Pasqualiani is elegant, charismatic, warm, mellifluous, expressive, and whenever he does something, he radiates a very serious sense of playfulness.
Just going to start with a relatively low intensity so that you have a sense of what it feels like. I've done this enough that I have a sense of where your motor cortex is going to be. TMS stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it is a way to stimulate, to apply currents to specific parts of the brain, but without having to cut open the skin, crack open the bone, and expose the brain.
Oh wow,
And
that was
now
my
you got
bicep.
sort of the biceps movement, right? That's sort of more your little finger. You know, one of the things that we've learned from TMS is that we can use it to map the brain. We can use it to understand how brain activity relates to behavior. We can also use it to modify the brain. We can use it, depending on the parameters of stimulation, to actually increase activity in a part of the brain or to suppress activity in a part of the brain. So I'm just going to target your language area. That will give you a little feel of what it is like when people are trying to speak and can't because of a stroke in that area. Go ahead.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's getting tough. I was still slurring my speech. Pasqualiani is now expanding his work to look at the autistic spectrum, which includes the childhood disorder of autism and Asperger's. And his working hypothesis is that they're both a product of hyperplasticity in the brain.
If the brain is plastic, and we believe it is, can plasticity itself, can the mechanisms of plasticity themselves be abnormal in certain conditions? Could it be that one has too much plasticity? And we think that autism spectrum disorders are exactly that.
There are certain things in autism and Asperger's that involve a hypersensitivity, and he's wondering whether these hypersensitivities are related to a very overconnected brain that's formed many, many plastic connections.
So that autism can generate an abnormal plasticity, an excessive plasticity, in fact. When the brain is excessively connected, it doesn't function well. There is recurrent thoughts, there is intrusions of thoughts, there is repetitive behaviors, ritualistic behaviors. If we are right, if the hypothesis is correct, then we would be able to use the capacity of brain stimulation to modulate activity, to suppress that plasticity tendency, and therefore, hopefully, to help with the symptoms of disease themselves.
Pasqualiani's remarkable experiments have shown that we can change and restructure our brain anatomy simply by using our imaginations.
One of the things I became interested in is the question of how do the maps change when you simply think of things, when you don't do anything other than thinking. We took normal subjects and we set them in front of a piano and asked them to learn to do a 5-finger movement exercise. They just had to go from thumb to little finger, back to thumb, back to little finger at a given rate. And we found that over these 5 days of practice, the part of the brain that controls finger flexions got larger and larger and larger. But we had another group of subjects who simply sat in front of the piano and imagined themselves moving. And we made sure that they did not move, but simply mentally rehearsed the actions. What we found in them is that the brain changed in exactly the same way as in those that actually physically practice. So the idea is that just thinking will change your brain. And what that ultimately means is that one needs to be careful with what one thinks.
This beautiful experiment complements the work of Nobel Prize-winning psychiatrist Eric Kandel, who showed that thinking actually turns on genes inside neurons to form new connections between brain cells. And this idea is further complemented by brain scans which show that psychoanalytic, cognitive, and other psychotherapies also change the brain structure through the use of thought alone.
I think we're now learning that in fact, the brain is changing all the time, that the brain is changing with everything we think, with everything we experience. That plasticity is an intrinsic property of the brain. And it's not something you can switch on and switch off. It's simply there. And so the challenge is to learn enough about it so that you can guide the changes.
My name is Derek Steen. I'm 41 years old. Grew up here in San Diego and was involved in a pretty traumatic motorcycle accident in 1985.
When we wish to perfect our senses, neuroplasticity can be a blessing. But when it works in the service of pain, it can be a curse.
There's days where I just feel phantom pain in the hand, and it feels like my hand's being crushed in a vice.
Plasticity can also result in phantom pain because when the reorganization is taking place after the amputation, there is some miswiring. Maybe some of the touch input is going and activating pain areas in the brain.
Our guide to neuroplasticity in pain is one of the most intriguing of the neuroplasticians, V.S. Ramachandran. Ramachandran is the magical wizard of modern neuroscience. He's the man who uses illusions to combat illusions and imagination to change the brain and its contents.
Many patients with phantom limbs can move their phantom, but I found that in some patients, maybe as many as a third, the phantom is immobilized. The patient will say things like it's frozen in stone.
After the amputation, my body actually, I could still feel the left arm in the sling sitting on my stomach. When I would try to make that phantom hand move, it created pain.
Hey Derek, how are you doing?
Good.
Good to see you back here again.
Thank you.
No one really knew what triggered the movement or pain in a phantom. Ramachandran wondered, was it possible that the face maps in people with amputated limbs had somehow invaded the maps for their arms?
What do you feel?
I can feel a stroking across the phantom hand.
Stroking right across the phantom hand?
And my face.
First of all, in normal people, the entire skin surface is mapped onto the opposite side of the brain. Now it turns out this is a systematic map, but the hand region on the map is right next to the face region in that brain map. How about, let's go back there.
It's towards the little finger.
Towards the little pinky, you said, yeah. And then after the arm has been amputated, there's a massive sensory loss, there's no sensory input to the hand region of the brain. If you now touch the patient's face, the message goes not only to the face area, as it should, but also invades the vacated territory corresponding to the missing hand. Here.
Index finger.
Here.
Thumb.
If I
can feel the tapping on the hand.
You feel the tapping on the hand. Here was striking evidence for plasticity in the adult human brain. In 3 weeks after amputation, the face input now activates the original hand area of the brain.
Ramachandran wondered if it would be possible to fight one illusion, a phantom limb, with another. What if he could trick the brain to think that the limb was moving by giving it some kind of false input?
So I want you to look in the mirror, put your right hand there, and look at the reflection of the right hand, kind of position the phantom sort of roughly so that it's kind of superposed.
Okay. He asked me to come down to his office one day and said he had something new he wanted me to look at. And he explained to me that he had a student that had built a mirror box.
And do you feel anything in your phantom?
I can feel my phantom. And I sat down, I put my hand in the box, and I'm hurting, you know, the phantom pain's flaring up, and I look in the box. And he said, look at your right hand. and start moving your fingers, and imagine your phantom left hand fingers moving.
What you're doing here is using one illusion, namely vision, to negate, quote unquote, the illusion of pain, because pain too is an illusion of sorts. Now I want you to tell me, what do you feel when you do that?
I can feel slow movement and resistance in the phantom hand. It was very shocking. Imagine moving your fingers and having them, a spirit go through and not touch.
So what we saw in Derek was quite amazing. Initially, he said the phantom was moving again when he looked in the mirror. When he closed his eyes, of course, the phantom was immobilized, didn't move. When he opened his eyes, again, it started moving. So we immediately knew that vision provides a critical role. You need to restore that whole visual motor congruence, and that's what seems to relieve the pain. So Derek, you want to try something a little bit different, okay? So where is your phantom now?
I can...
Sort of roughly in that region?
Yeah.
Okay. Another thing we have recently observed, which is very striking, and it's absolutely amazing, it blew my mind when I first saw it. So I'm going to put my hand here.
Okay.
And I'm just going to either stroke it or tap it or do something with it. And I want to know if you feel anything on your face. On your you have a patient with a phantom limb. And the patient simply watching the normal person being poked and stroked and touched, he starts feeling the pokes, touches, and strokes in his missing phantom hand.
I can feel a vague tapping.
And this blew my mind. It's almost like X-Files. It's empathy carried to the extreme. Now, why does it happen? Again, it turns out there's a perfectly logical explanation based on what we know of the anatomy of the brain. If I'm a normal person and somebody touches me, sensory neurons in my brain fire.
I feel tapping.
You feel tapping on your phantom?
Yes.
Okay. And astonishingly, some of these neurons, touch neurons in my brain, will fire when somebody touches you. And these are called mirror neurons, because for obvious reasons. This neuron, which I call a Gandhi neuron, is actually dissolving the barrier between you and another human being. That neuron doesn't know the difference between whether he's being touched or you're being touched. How about if I do that? Clinically, they may be important, because these neurons may be revived using visual input, and it may be one reason there's recovery from paralysis using visual feedback. So let's try the thumping again. The idea of neuroplasticity is quite beyond any doubt now. There is a tremendous amount of malleability, and you can tap into this, maybe even to enhance brain function, certainly to accelerate recovery of brain function. It's essentially a new era of research in brain plasticity and clinical applications.
This is a double letter. 2, 3, 4, 8, 16, 24.
When Michelle was just a few weeks old, I noticed that she didn't have all the normal movements that the other babies had had. And I remember telling Wally, something's wrong with Michelle.
I went to visit Michelle Mack because I wanted to test the upper limits of human neuroplasticity. Something catastrophic happened in Michelle's brain when she was in the womb. We don't know what it was, but for some reason, one of her hemispheres never developed. Michelle Mack is a woman who was born with just half a brain.
I was born missing the left hemisphere of my brain. My parents weren't given enough information because at that time there were no MRI machines, and that my brain would only progress until I was about 11 and then stop.
Carol brought Michelle to the National Institutes of Health in Maryland because she'd read an article by Dr. Jordan Grafman that contradicted everything she had learned about the brain and been told about Michelle's prognosis.
It's dramatic. It includes not only the cortex, but her left thalamus. It's all missing.
Dr. Grafman had worked with people who had had severe brain damage, including a lot of Vietnam vets, and was able to show that brain development could take place after a trauma.
And it's important to merge this sort of brain anatomy picture with the person as a whole. Michelle's brain works much in the same way that our brains might work, but the functions that are available to her are somewhat more restricted.
Some of the things she has trouble with are when something is very vague.
Anything that's not concrete.
Grafman's theory provides a compelling explanation as to how Michelle's right hemisphere took over so many of the functions that are normally governed by the left.
We know that now that she can perform certain skills that the left hemisphere ordinarily subserves, they must now be located in the right hemisphere. So we know she's had some dramatic plasticity to enable her to have normal verbal skills, normal verbal memory.
You also have a number of special skills. What are some of those?
Memorizing dates.
Do you remember when I came here last?
Yes.
When was that?
That was in June of 2003.
Do you remember what day that was?
Yes, that was Thursday, June 5th.
Let's say we had a family reunion in Colorado.
Sunday, July 9th to Sunday, July 16th, 2000.
How about July 17th, 1989?
That was a Monday.
And how did you do that?
I don't know. Hi. Hello.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm fine.
Well, we've learned from her these general concepts about plasticity. And I think now what we're going to try to do is to study them in more detail. You have part of your brain missing from that area, but you talk pretty much like I do. Right, exactly. So we want to see what the limits are of this plasticity and whether under some restrictions we can influence the plasticity in some way to promote certain functions that the family and the child would benefit from.
I want people to see that I function on a normal level, even though there are some things that I'll never be able to do.
When I think of Michelle, it's hard to imagine a better test or illustration of the resilience of human neuroplasticity. It may be easy for some people to dismiss these fantastic case studies as anomalies that have little bearing on the lives of the rest of us.
Many people react by saying, but that's just one patient. It's an N of 1. But my usual rhetorical response to this is to say, well, look, supposing I bring a pig to this podium and I say, this pig can talk, you'll say, really? And I wave my wand and it starts talking, what would your reaction be? You're not going to say, well, that's just an N of 1, show me another pig. You'd say, my God, that pig is talking. And yet, the reaction of some of my colleagues is to say, show me another talking pig.
To understand that we have within our hands this incredible power to drive changes in the brain that accounts for our behavior, that is, in fact, the very basis of what we are, of the person that we are. You know, what a gift.
The brain that I met in my travels turns out to be both a more resilient and a more vulnerable brain than we had imagined. By being more resilient, it stirs up an incredible amount of hope for people with all sorts of brain and psychological problems. What we've been introduced to here is the first generation of neuroplasticians. They are just beginning to elaborate and elucidate the limits and what neuroplasticity can do. Much awaits us down the road.